Welcome to our Loeb Leadership Real Talk. I'm David Sarnoff. I'm the Director of Strategic Partnerships and an executive coach with Loeb Leadership. We're a proud certified woman-owned business that focuses on executive coaching, training and development, and consulting. And we're really excited to have our panel here today, David Robert, Dr. Fritz Gillette, Joyce Stevens, and Tamara Fox, to talk about the impact of emotionally intelligent leaders. And as we've seen, emotional intelligence is becoming more and more embraced, relevant, and a distinguishing factor among managers and leaders in how they lead people and teams and manage conflict and stress and difficult conversations. We could spend a whole day on emotional intelligence, but for purposes of our session here, I'll throw out just a broad definition, and then I'll ask Fritz to go a little deeper. So when I talk to people generally about emotional intelligence, I focus on the factor of it being elevating your self-awareness, understanding how you show up, how you're perceived by others, and recognizing the impact of your words and actions on colleagues, team members, and even friends and family. Fritz, I'd like to bring you in now, as I know emotional intelligence coaching and study is a focus of yours. How would you describe it?
When I get into emotional intelligence with people, I do give them that high-level overview, and then I start to talk to them about the different ways that emotions can show up in them and how they can become better at detecting it. I'm often asking people to stop for a moment and scan their bodies, notice what's happening inside of them, seeing if they have the emotional vocabulary to name the emotion that they're feeling. In the English language, there's about 400 to 450 plus words that we can use to label an emotion. And most of us can probably do less than 20 emotions, 5, that's right, off the top of our head: happy, mad, sad, glad. But when I work with people to help them nuance it and really get to the core of the feelings that they're feeling, I also work with them on determining where that feeling is coming from and what feeling they would like to have. And then we may work together in a way to help them learn how to get from this feeling that they're having to a feeling they'd like to get to. Feeling has a lot of information in it. In a society that puts a primacy on the neocortex, on the thinking brain, we often don't stop in and tune into what's happening inside of us. Now, the other aspect to emotional intelligence I like to remind people of is that part of high emotional intelligence is being able to detect it in others. But it doesn't mean that you are mind reading or trying to figure out from over here what emotion that person is having, but to just make you more consciously aware from moment to moment that those micro expressions and reactions by another person might be showing you that something is also going on for them, and then having the interpersonal relatedness and skills to find out what's going on with them. Now, when we study emotional intelligence, we don't just limit it just to those concepts. When we test people or give assessments, we look across a wide variety of areas that include self-reflection, stress management, decision-making, how people interact interpersonally, and self-expression. And when we get people to apply, we get some really good data and scores in all of those areas. So as a person works to improve your emotional intelligence, which you can do, we can do very much to improve your emotional intelligence, people start to become better managers and leaders. They become more self-aware of when they themselves are in an emotionally distressed state. Sometimes I'll even put a pulse ox on someone's finger and show them that your elevated heart rate may now correlate with your ability to be creative and empathetic. And I also talk to them about how when they manage their emotions and keep them in a nice balance with intellect, they're better able to be creative problem solvers and interacting with others. I could talk all day, but I'll let the others jump in.
Thank you so much, Fritz. Would anybody like to add to the definition?
Sure. I'll go. So I think I appreciate what Dr. Fritz shared, but I think that one of the missing pieces is the willingness and the ability to flex your style in order to optimize an interaction with a colleague or to optimize a situation. Because I could be incredibly self-aware that I'm abrasive, right? So I know I'm abrasive. I know when I show up, it ruffles people's feathers. But if I'm not willing to adapt my style in order to avoid that conflict, then that's not emotional intelligence. So really, it's two. I see it as two sides of the same coin. One is a keen sense of self-awareness. I know what my strengths are, what my limitations are. I know how I show up and the implication that has on other people. But I also have the willingness and the skill to be able to adapt my style in order to accommodate the needs of the people I'm working with as well.
I'd like to just add a little bit to that as well. Like, first off, you're dead on, David. And I'd add that I've seen this in real time in some of the discussions that I have, especially if we're doing something like MBTI or DISC assessment or something, that people should discover what category they're in. And then instead of using it as a tool to bridge the gap in the communication with someone else, they use it as a crutch of, well, this is just how I am. And going to David's point, then refusing to adapt or even meet someone halfway because I've told you who I am now, come to me. And I think if you're trying to influence people and convince them to go along with your idea and lead in any kind of way, you can't have that come to me sort of attitude.
Thank you so much, Joy. So Tamara, bringing you into the conversation now that we have a nice fuller definition, we understand broadly about emotional intelligence. Is this something a manager, an individual contributor, can they measure it?
Yeah. So as Fritz alluded to, emotional intelligence is not fixed, and it's actually something we can develop. So we often refer to emotional intelligence as EQ, our emotional quotient, and our IQ is what all of us know is fixed at a certain point in your life. The nice thing with EQ is it's not fixed. You can continue to develop it for the rest of your life. And to speak to what Joy said earlier on, once we know who we are and how we show up, as leaders, it is our responsibility then to meet people halfway, to adapt who we are, to show up differently, leveraging our emotional intelligence in which to do so. One way to measure emotional intelligence is actually through an assessment called the emotional quotient, or the EQI 2.0 and 360. I know David, you, me, and Fritz are all certified in that. It's a certification you have to go through and be trained on the science behind it. It's scientifically valid and credible. It's a level B instrument. So only those who have been trained on the assessment can actually debrief it. There's first the self-assessment, which is what we spoke about, how we view ourselves in the 15 different subscales of emotional intelligence, which includes empathy, stress tolerance, interpersonal relationships, and more. But then there's also the 360 component, which I think is even that much more important for leaders, because I could think I am the most self-aware person ever, but my team or my peers or my manager how they view me could be completely different. So when you get that 360 assessment, the nice piece is it shows you, again, how you view yourself, but how others view you as well. So it shows you your blind spot, because as individual contributors, as managers, as leaders, no matter what position you are, we all have blind spots. And the key with emotional intelligence is saying, oh, this is a blind spot I wasn't aware of, but I'm going to work and fix that. And I'm going to develop that, and I'm going to change that. So it's no longer a blind spot of mine. It's an area of development.
Thank you, Tamara. And when Tamara said David, she meant me on that one about being certified. Well, it's tough with two Davids. A lot of people call me DB as well. So appreciate that. So Joy, now I would like to get your thoughts on actually seeing what emotional intelligence looks like in real life, in the workplace. I've been studying a lot recently about workplace bullying, which impacts over 30% of employees in the United States every year, which equates to almost 50 million people. It's at an epidemic level. Certainly bias, microaggressions, interactions and events and conflicts that in many cases become highly emotionally charged in the moment. And there's an opportunity to address it by either de-escalating it or intervening in a way that escalates it. So how would you approach these situations?
Well, first off, on the data that you cited, Me with no background, I haven't done any studying, just me looking out at the world. I think that number is probably higher because I've seen people who don't even realize that they are being affected by the bullying that they're seeing third party style. They watch something happen to somebody else and they think, I'm glad that's not happening to me. Maybe they don't get involved, but they also are now exposed to an idea of, I can't do this. It didn't happen to me, but because I saw it happen to someone else, I'm going to shrink myself. I'm going to stay in my lane, keep my head down, do my job, etc. And that also affects other interpersonal interactions. A new person comes in and they're told, never do this. And they don't know why, because somebody 2 years ago saw somebody else get bullied for it. So it affects a lot more people than I think even recognize it. But then how do we confront it? How do we address it? Confrontation doesn't have to be confrontational. I know that sounds like fake deep, but here's what I mean. If you want to help someone understand how their words are affecting someone, that's what you start with, understanding or helping them to understand how their words could affect somebody else. Because if you come out with what you said was wrong, or any of the isms, or the racist, homophobic, sexist, etc., they are not going to be able to hear you. They're going to hear you tell them you're a bad person. And since we don't know where they fall on the spectrum of emotional intelligence, they could come back with something relatively positive of, tell me more, tell me what I did, explain it from your point of view, which would be an emotionally intelligent response to being confronted with that. But also, more often than not, a knee-jerk reaction of, I didn't do anything wrong, I'm not a bad person, because they cannot separate the two in their mind. And for people that have had some exposure, assessment with emotional intelligence, or what have you, and they're exposed to that terminology, you also have to recognize a whole lot of people around you that have not had that class, that certification, what have you. And so you become, this is going to sound trite, you become the voice of reason in the moment. And so if you're trying to address someone that you don't know where their emotional intelligence falls, assume that it falls on the low end. That way you can make sure that you're doing everything you can to keep them involved or engaged in that conversation. Approaching them with a discussion on the behavior or the actual, tangible word or action or what have you, and not on, you did something, but this was what I saw. The way you frame it can help people ease into it. There's a lot more to discuss, but again, emotional intelligence, relative to the other things that we have in our toolbox as managers and leaders in any industrial space, is relatively new. And so a lot of people don't know how to use it. And as with any tool, you can use it to, like a hammer, I can break a window or build a house. People can use this to their advantage, or they can manipulate it. So it all depends on the person. I think I'm going too far. So
thank you, Dre. And I also just want to put it out there, we would love this to be an interactive session with the audience. Please feel free to submit questions in the chat, or let us know if you'd like to unmute to engage the panel. So Fritz, building on what Joy said, we all coach individuals and do consulting in organizations where some of these interactions, let's say either an incidence of bullying or a conflict that gets escalated, there's a lot of emotion, people's breathing becomes rapid, blood pressure goes up. The Daniel Goleman coined the phrase amygdala hijack, where our amygdala gland senses fear and threat. And once it's under stress, adrenaline and cortisol get into the bloodstream, and our ability to access logic and reasoning becomes physically impaired. How would a highly emotionally intelligent manager or leader intervene in a escalated situation?
An escalated situation, somebody with high emotional intelligence already knows where they are and is already engaged in their own compensatory mechanisms to lower or stabilize their stress levels and their reaction levels inside of them. When I've measured people's heart rates, or just asked them to take a little measure of what their heart rate is at, and if their heart rate is at 120, 130 beats per minute, it's really hard to be very creative and flexible, especially as you go further and further up. And to the point of willingness, so I appreciate that, because a lot of people are willing to be very adaptive and creative and willing to be emotionally intelligent when they're in a relaxed situation. But a lot of us, our work situations are not relaxed. They're volatile situations or uncertain. This is the world that we live in. And when the blood pressures are high, we start to default to very primal ways of being. That amygdala hijack, that central part of the brain, that starts to go into action. And so the highly intelligent, emotionally intelligent leader, and it's not just a concept of having a high score on it, but really walking that talk and being that individual. My concern is the person that is not willing to do that or is willing to weaponize what they know, that's sociopathic. That's a different kind of thing. But the individual that is wanting to have positive impact and has that high emotional intelligence will recognize, oh, I'm elevated. Let me do something to take care of myself in this moment before I enter. Let me think this through before I speak. And just take that breath. And that is why I'm often asking people just to take a breath. Even as you're listening, allow the breath to go into the diaphragm. And when I teach leaders about this, they eventually start to incorporate this into their everyday walk and talk. And then they're able to enter situations that are complex and volatile, but they already have done some wusa work. And they're able to enter in there and be creative and be flexible. And a lot of times they're still doing a great job of doing a lot of listening and taking it all in before intervening.
Thank you, Fritz. Tamara.
Yeah, I just want to add to what Fritz said and Joy said in an interesting way. So Joy's point on our statistics are lower likely than what is actually occurring in the workplace. Much of that is contributed because employees are afraid of sharing pieces around bullying or other items that are impacting them in the workplace because they do not have emotionally intelligent leaders who they trust so they can share that information with. So when Joy said the numbers are definitely higher, that is true because there is a huge population of employees who are even afraid to speak up. So our data is always skewed in that aspect. And to what Fritz is saying, though, if we had those leaders who someone could go to and say, here is what's going on for me, or here is what I'm experiencing, and the leader or manager didn't turn around and react in a negative way or a heightened way, that is where the employee feels that safe sense of safety, that sense of trust, because they have a leader who said, even if they don't like what the employee's asking or maybe saying from them, they process and recognize in their head, okay, I'm not going to react to this in a way that's going to be abrasive or scare this employee or create fear or intimidate this employee. Even if I don't like what they have to say, I'm going to process that and respond back to them in a professional, mature way that shows I am their leader. I'm here to support them. I'm here to help them and get to a good place together.
Joy,
No.
you want to jump in?
I was giggling when Fritz was speaking, not because he wasn't perfectly right, but because I was imagining some of the techniques that I've used myself when I've come across things that heighten me emotionally. I do a lot of DE&I work, and sometimes I'll get a challenge in a class or a workshop that I'm teaching, and I will listen to the person, even though their point of view is different from mine, because I know that there's a point they're trying to make. There's a reason that they're speaking. And all of this comes from my ability to step back and say, why is this happening? And use my emotional intelligence not to give a reaction in the moment that's probably going to derail the whole thing. But there's a visual that I have sometimes in the back of my mind when someone's confronting me with something or bringing me something that I may not agree with or that I think is incendiary, and it's a fire-breathing dragon. And so I will look at them on screen and I'll think, okay, and I'll try to hear them in the back of my mind. The venom, the knee-jerk reaction, the hijack goes into this fire-breathing dragon that goes back and forth a couple times, and then I'm back. And they never see any of that, but it happens about once a month. And so when we talk about emotional intelligence, it doesn't mean you don't feel the thing. You feel it. You know how you want to react, but you elevate and say, I'm not going to do that in this moment because it's counterproductive and I can control my own emotions, even though I may have a visual in my mind that is my anger interpreter.
Joy, I love that you're using an internal imagery to actually create a little focal point for that energy to go to. And that reminds me of what I'm often doing as that stuff is coming up. I am imagining each breath I take, I'm breathing to it. And I'm putting out the heat and the fire that's coming up. But I do not want people to think this means suppress and repress, because that is what leads to it being internalized in your body. We want to be able to, in real time, address and honor the feelings that we're having, while taking the breaths that it takes and while pacing ourselves so that we can engage appropriately, responding, not reacting to that fire.
So, David, Robert, I'd love to get your expert opinion and thoughts with respect to what's been discussed so far. That there are organizations where there are employees and stakeholders that spend some of their time working in fear or not being comfortable or not feeling safe, and that can contribute to high attrition, difficulty in recruiting. It can impact performance and productivity. So, being the culture expert you are, what steps could leaders in an organization take to try to infuse and instruct on emotional intelligence throughout an organization?
Sure. Well, let me answer that question indirectly. A quick step back, DB. So, again, I know I'm biased because I live and breathe culture work, but I think that the goal of every organization should be to create or foster a culture that is in some way anchored to trust. Because the research is crystal clear. When we trust each other, and more specifically, when we trust the people we work for, we are much more agile, resilient, loyal, and productive. So why wouldn't that be the endpoint for an organization, right? And I would love to hear from my co-panelists. I don't see a path to trust without a high degree of an emotional intelligence across your management team. I just don't see how that's possible, right? So, and so, if I were in a senior leader, well, yeah, but if I were, thinking about transforming the culture of my organization, I would do it through the lens of trust for sure. And I would hold my leaders accountable. This is the issue I see more often than not, is that organizations, they talk a good game, like we want to be a culture of respect, a culture of inclusion, a culture of transparency, a culture of trust, but they haven't taken the step, which I think is the most difficult part of culture transformation, is to examine your human programs and policies, right? So do you have the programs and policies that actually reward the behavior you want to see? And oftentimes what an organization says they want to become and what they reward are in conflict with each other. And so when we're advising clients around culture work, that's one of the steps that we take. It's like, let's open up your benefits and your value proposition and make sure that you are rewarding the right behavior, because more often than not, whether it's intentional or not, we are rewarding behavior that is in conflict for the desired future that we want to create. And again, I can say that it's a difficult step in the culture transformation, because there are a lot of people within an organization who are benefiting from the status quo. And so there's not a huge appetite for change, because it will feel like a loss to them, right? Because they've benefited and they've created coping mechanisms around the status quo. Very, very difficult part of a culture transformation, but a necessary part if you are serious about creating a desired culture around trust or inclusion.
So, David, when you talk about accountability, I always find that as the linchpin for almost any initiative in an organization. But in my experience, particularly in the legal profession, there's firms and legal departments that do make those statements of what kind of culture we are, what our mission statement is, what our vision is. But inevitably, there might be influential leaders, and for example, in a law firm, a rainmaker who feels empowered to maybe act outside those stated norms. And where I see things breaking down is typically that person is not held accountable. And what does that do to the entire initiative? Or how would you go about trying to hold that person accountable?
Well, I mean, I know I've talked about this before, but in literally every organization I've supported around culture transformation, they hit this crossroads, right? This sort of like the fork in the road, where it's like Now, this is where it becomes really serious, right? If you really believe and you are willing to support what you're telling your people that what's happening. So if you have a desire, if you've articulated a desired endpoint in terms of what your culture should be, then you should be willing to back that up, right? Through accountability. And it's super easy to hold people accountable. That you can do a very quick survey of their people. How do you feel about your manager? Do you trust your manager? Are you receiving support? A million different ways you could kind of slice this, and then show them the results and say, wow, your people are not seeing you in the way that we want them to see you. What's going on? And put them on some kind of course correction. But again, to your point, DB, we're unwilling to do that if this person is, let's say, an owner of the company, a partner of the company, making a ton of money for the company, right? So it's much more challenging to have that accountability conversation when you have someone in that role, right? But I know that, again, in organizations I've supported, I encourage them. It doesn't have to be a super complicated process, but you can collect data from their respective areas in terms of how people feel about them, and have some threshold in terms of what percent of your people should feel positively about you, should feel motivated by you, should respect you or trust you. And if that leader is falling short of that threshold, it's a conversation you have to have, because the risks are way too high. We all know how expensive it is to find and replace talent. We all know, those numbers, right? And the hassle around business continuity. And I think the risks are too high for an organization not to evaluate its managers through the lens of EQ and trust.
Can I add to that as well, DB?
Yeah.
So I echo everything David says, and I know him and I align deeply on this content because we do the same work. But what I will say too, what we often see with a lot of organizations is we'll get executive leaders who say their managers then need to go through some type of EQ training or EQ development, but then the executive or the highest level leadership within the organization is doing nothing, which is very contradictory and very confusing for everyone. So with any cultural transfer or any transformation initiative from an org level, you have to start at the top. I know we always talk about this and our real talks, but if everyone at the top is not bought into what is happening, to then David's point, hold people accountable, model appropriate behavior, have difficult conversations that are necessary to have, it's not going to work. So we see, again, a lot of firms, a lot of organizations come to us and say, our managers need to be trained in EQ. And oftentimes, David and I will respond to them and say, well, what are you doing for your leadership? What are the executive team doing? How are we creating alignment? Again, because transformation has to be holistic. It has to be everyone. It can't just be a subset of the organization.
So to that point, Tamara, and open it up to you and the panel, if there is a manager, director in an organization that embraces emotional intelligence, believes in its effectiveness, how would you advise them to sell it to their leadership who may be skeptical, may be resistant or guarded to it?
Well, it depends on what the organization values. I mean, to David's point, there is a lot of data behind this, that employees don't leave organizations, they leave managers. So they could talk to their HR team. I don't know if they could get this data, but talk to the HR team and ask information around attrition and retention rates. And if it's specific to departments, they may not be able to get by manager for confidentiality reasons, but find out more on retention issues, see what is going on to see if, or is that organization doing exit interviews? I think there's a lot of information they could try and gather first to then go to the executive team to get their buy-in and support. And a lot of times with any initiative, it's just educating the executive team because they're not aware. They're not culture experts. They're not DE&I. This is not their wheelhouse. They aren't focusing. They're not immersed in this. So they're immersed in focusing on meeting business goals, keeping the board happy, being profitable. They're focused in that space. So until it's brought to their attention, oftentimes they're completely unaware to the fact that this is important until somebody shows them the data, shows them the information that supports the need for this work.
This is why I often like to jump into those kinds of conversations and try to figure out ways to not only get to people's intellectual understanding of these things, but what it means to them on a deeper basis. It is really hard to get humans to change just with intellect alone. We just know this all too clearly. Just look at our world the way it is right now. Humans change when they're motivated, and not only motivated by what they see happening to other people, but when something shifts inside of you. And so sometimes we have these really good leaders that get the idea and they do the work, and the space around them starts to improve. But I think I've heard David Roberts say this many times. It's not going to change unless we install it into our policies, our procedures, our practices. We have to codify it, because if it doesn't get there, it's like a virus that stays in the system.
I just want to add on a couple of things, because you said the word sell, and that jerk, that triggered like 18 years of my life. And so approaching someone from an emotional standpoint, because we know all decisions are made from an emotional point of view, regardless of what we may believe. But some people, to Fritz's point, they get it, and so they may be willing at a senior leadership level to take an assessment, to be a part of the growth of the organization, to not expect their people to do anything they wouldn't be willing to do themselves. They're leading by example. That's an easy sell. The harder sell is someone that says, well, they need to do it, I don't need to do it. This isn't about me, it's about them, etc. The deflections. And I found this to work exactly twice. And so I'm not saying that this is a foolproof thing, but there's this old adage, don't ask a question you don't want the answer to. And I'll bring that up and say, well, I understand, don't ask the question you don't want to answer to. My question to you is, why don't you want that answer? And then it triggers something different, a little bit of I'm fine with it. It's a very professional way of saying, what are you scared of? That can sometimes work. I told you it's worked exactly twice. So I just throw that out there for anybody that might want to try that.
Thank you, Joy. And we have a question from a participant.
Wait, I think David had something.
Oh, sorry.
Go to the question. I can come back.
Okay. So a participant asked a question that they agree leaders need to be on board. But what if the leader intends to be involved and I guess is supporting the initiative, but they're too busy, in quotes, to actually participate? How do you work around that?
Goes back to what David said on accountability. Are they holding people because we prioritize what's important to us. So on a personal level and an organizational level. So if the organization as a whole or the firm as a whole, that top leadership comes out and says, we prioritize that our leaders are emotionally intelligent and create psychological safety and trust in our workplaces, then we're going to hold you accountable for it. It then is no longer something that you can get by saying I'm too busy for it, because it's no longer acceptable for that to be an excuse, because you're accountable to it.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think the time excuse is not appropriate. I mean, ask any working parent, how do you raise a family and hold a full-time job? You figure it out, right? So, and you make trade-offs in terms of what's important at the moment, right? So, I mean, and we hear that a lot, is that I don't have time to do this. I don't have. Well, then what's filling your time? What's filling your calendar? And those are the most important things, right? So what's more important than business continuity and risk avoidance for your business, right? Especially if you're an owner or a partner of a business, you want to protect that investment. And so why wouldn't you want to take a really hard look in terms of where you're spending your time and make the appropriate adjustments, right? And actually, I'm glad the participant asked that question, because it aligns with my comment I was going to make. So I think, going back to the sell question, DB, I think I'll be a little more blunt. I think we have to get our head out of the sand. We live in a very different world than we did even 2 or 3 years ago, right? I mean, our relationship with work has shifted dramatically. Our relationship with each other has changed. Our priorities and needs have shifted significantly. And we saw that during the Great Resignation. People are no longer willing to deal with their work environment that they did pre-pandemic. They're not willing to do it anymore. And we know this, right? So I can't think of a more important and a more urgent thing right now than equipping our managers to be able to manage through volatility and ambiguity and chaos and generational differences. We are extremely polarized in this country, and that absolutely seeps into our workplace. And so how do you manage that anxiety and that anger? I can't imagine a more important thing to invest in right now than to make sure our managers are showing up listen, we're human. We don't always get it right, but more often than not, the default way they show up is actually empathizing and building trust. I can't imagine anything more important right now.
One piece too is when that too busy or selling piece, we talk about this all the time. Behavior change takes time. I think oftentimes people see initiatives, whatever that is, DE&I, EQ, doesn't matter, you name it, in the space and the work that we do, and they see this gigantic mountain and they get really scared because they're like, that's huge, that's time consuming, and that's expensive. When reality is you have to take small incremental steps to get there. Your leaders aren't going to all wake up tomorrow and be these like on the extremely high end of emotional intelligence. They're all going to be in different places. But what you take small action steps towards what is our larger goal as an organization to get there, knowing and recognizing that behavior change takes a lot of time and giving people the space to change appropriately according to their own change continuum.
Just to add to that, if you don't mind. So I think another challenge as well is, I think that again, academically, we train managers to think in very linear ways, and culture shift is not linear. And that frustrates people because they don't see it going always in the same direction, because culture work is really 2 steps forward, a half step to the left, a step back, 3 steps forward. And that doesn't always sit well with people, right? For us who work in the culture space, we're very accustomed to that. It doesn't freak us out. But when you are advising a leader or a management team who's programmed to think very linearly, culture work can be very intimidating to them as well.
Thank you for that, David. I want to go back to something you said and put it out to the panel about polarization and the stress in the workplace. And this also has a generational component, in my opinion, from observations and interactions that I've had, particularly around workplace safety and feeling psychologically safe. I mean, I know Dr. Fritz doesn't like to use the term safe space because, to his point, I can't make it safe. I don't know what's going to make it unsafe for you. In this world of polarization and difficulty communicating with each other, particularly in hybrid environments where we don't have the power of proximity to be in person and have those direct conversations in many cases, how would you advise a manager or leader to even engage on these topics? Because I coach some managers and directors who really struggle with this.
I'd start by saying, and it goes back to why at times I've objected to the automatic saying of safe space, because for a lot of people, the systems, the workplace never was a safe space for them. And they would observe it by seeing what happens when people speak their minds, or what happens when people show their genuine selves. They have lots of examples that have shown them and demonstrated time and time again. You need to hold your cards close to your chest, especially in a workplace that isn't high trust. So what managers need to do, and ones that are aspiring toward the ideals of high emotional intelligence, is to recognize we are not all experiencing this moment in the same way. The generations before us are programmed, we raised them, so it's our fault, but they are not experiencing the workplace the same way. And that if you are wanting to make a change, you've got to install into your walk and your talk and your ideals and your policies and your practices and your rules over and over again. Install an aspiration to change those things. We all have different lived experiences, and I am often reminding people of that till I'm blue in the face, because when you're aware the other person across from you is experiencing this thing differently based upon a whole set of life demographics, you might be still a little bit more open and curious to finding out, hey, what was that like for you? Hey, the other day during the meeting when so-and-so brought up something and so-and-so made a face, what was that like for you? And when you do that and demonstrate that you're willing to do that incrementally, you might be starting to create a space that is safe for that person and those interactions or those witnesses. And leaders have to model that. I'm also reminding leaders that sometimes you may be the one that made that face or did that thing. You need to go back and check how people experience that. Because for you, I just didn't like the idea. But sometimes you scratch your nose during a meeting because you don't like something, and you just ruin somebody's day, and they're never going to speak up again.
Joy?
I got to listen to Dr. Fritz and completely forgot what I was about to say. So.
It is mesmerizing.
I also was a little mesmerized too, but it's to Fritz's point, it's that permission to be human. So I think a lot of organizations, especially when we talk about generational differences, the generations, so Boomer and Gen X, were not given permission to talk about feelings. We're not given when they entered the workforce, and maybe for much of their time in the workforce, were not given permission to be human. They were given permission to be an employee who was productive and who met goals. That was how they were ingrained, and that was their behavior they were taught from the time they entered the workforce. Whereas now the generations, Millennial and Gen Z, are coming into the workforce saying, I don't care what you tell me. I'm going to feel how I want to feel. And I'm going to tell you how I feel. And I'm going to be honest about how I feel and talk about my emotions. So there's this very stark contrast in the two generations when it comes to feelings, and also accepting within organizations that we are human and we do have different feelings. We do have different lived experiences. We do all respond and react to things differently, and making that a part of the conversation. So if I'm having a conversation with Fritz and he says something to me that doesn't sit well with me or bothers me in any way, I have that permission to be human and look at him and say, you know what, Fritz, what you just said to me just doesn't settle well. Can we explore that together? Can we come back to that? Like, naming again those feelings and those emotions, which for two generations is much more difficult to do than for the other two generations, is where the workplace is moving. And it all comes into this EQ component, this emotional intelligence component, talking about how we feel, talking about how things are going within an organization. That's not, I met my sales goals, I hit my metrics, I kept this client happy. It's, how did you feel while doing it? Are you happy? And those things now matter, which again is why if leaders aren't trained to talk about emotional intelligence, to have real authentic conversations with their employees, they're going to lose those newer generations within the workforce because they're striving for that.
You know, that actually, it's jogged my memory what I wanted to say. So thank you, Tamara, because my observation with this is that emotional intelligence writ large is not so much a tool as it is a technology, especially when we talk about the differences in like age, generational gaps. Think about the way the younger generations are adaptable to new technology, and some things they were just, you're no longer born with a silver spoon in your mouth. You're born with an iPhone in your mouth, right? So the ability to use certain things that's just the way they were brought up, to expect this, to see this, to think of it as integrated into their everyday society. And I think emotional expression, not necessarily intelligence, but emotional expression, outward expression, is more baked into the younger generation. So they come into the workforce expecting people to know how to express themselves, if not to have an emotionally intelligent conversation. And the expression is the first half of it, but they're hitting people because naturally just from my age progression that are at higher levels in the organization that did not have that technological foundation. So we make the jokes about knowing how to convert a PDF. We make the jokes about knowing how to use your iPhone, but knowing how to talk about your emotions, I think, is also a big generational gap that can express itself in negative ways if you're not careful, if you're not understanding. I hear a lot of Gen X and baby boomer leaders say, well, I didn't have that, so why should I have to learn that for the next group? You didn't have computers either. You didn't have cell phones. There's a lot of things that you didn't have that you now know how to operate effectively to continue to communicate with your audience. And so this is just another form.
A quick aside, a lot of our older generations in a rougher work environment have had a lot of traumas that can't get away with as much anymore. And so it's important to remember that they're often experiencing well, I got raked along cold, or I got beat up and he's like that. And they often make the mistake of trying to keep that tradition alive, whether it's consciously or unconsciously.
Yeah.
DB, can I just bring up a topic, kind of playing devil's advocate, because like we all seem kind of aligned around the importance of EQ and the implication it has on productivity and resilience and the mental health. But it's not always beneficial. I mean, it could be overused. And so I kind of wanted to share some thoughts about like just some cautionary thoughts. If you are making an investment on increasing the emotional intelligence of your management staff, here are some things I would be looking out for. Like the first thing is like, if you're not authentically trying to empathize and put yourself in somebody else's shoes, then that interaction becomes very disingenuous. And when somebody detects inauthenticity, they're going to lose credit. You're going to lose credibility, and that's not an ingredient for building trust. And so, you have to practice, but if you're not really showing up in an authentic way, that could be actually more destructive than constructive. I think that if you are super hyper focused on making sure everybody else is well, then you are setting yourself up for burnout. And so you kind of have to balance like the needs of others with your own needs, right, and your own well-being as well. And I think that and another one too is that again, I'm probably guilty of this in some ways, but I know I've been a recipient of this, is that, people can overuse or sort of manipulate EQ in order to kind of pull you into a direction they want you to go in, right? For their own sort of self-serving needs, right? And so, they're trying to empathize with you and they're stroking your ego and because they want you to move in their direction rather than you being an independent thinker. So, and there are other things around boundary respect, that you might overuse EQ and you might like intimidate or offend somebody because you're prying too deeply. So these are things that I would look out for if you are making an investment in equipping your leaders with skills around EQ.
And it doesn't mean, sorry, really quick, DB, it doesn't mean that you still can't hold people accountable for performance. So that's the other, I know, to add to David's point, like we do get in these conversations and we are so all aligned and passionate. Being an emotionally intelligent leader doesn't mean that you don't have productive teams that meet performance goals. Because if you are, to David's point, you can't just be too empathetic, too flexible, too tolerant of behavior in order to not meet performance. So there are ways that you can leverage your EQ to still continue to meet business goals.
Right. Yeah. So David, to that point, because as you were describing the misuse, I think, what you're saying about emotional intelligence, I view that as manipulation or exploiting, where I coach highly emotionally intelligent leaders to influence behavior of motivating, inspiring, giving direction, feedback, and collaboration in a direct way, where you're still trying to change someone else's behavior, but I look at it more as a positive, productive way as opposed to a manipulative way.
I think EQ has far more positive benefits than negative, of course, but any leadership skill or competency can be overused and that has serious implications, right? I mean, I always think, when I think about the overuse of EQ, you can't lose sight of rational thinking. Like you have to stay connected to rationality. And I think that, I can see scenarios where you're trying so hard to make everybody happy that you lose the lines around rationality get blurred. And that's not appropriate emotional intelligence, because one of the I think foundational pieces of EQ is sound decision making, right? So you can't lose sight of the rational aspects, right? So
I think we have to remember in a workplace culture where your leader and leaders are working toward high emotional intelligence, if one is using it in a manipulative way, hopefully you have a check and balance system in place where others can see that and hold them accountable for not doing that. And psychological safety often comes up, and I think the author or the leading researcher who evolved that concept makes a point to say that psychological safety, and I think it applies to EQ as well, isn't about being woo-woo and nice and disingenuous in that way. Actually, in a high trust, emotion and psychologically safe space, you still could get really good critical feedback. It's actually in a lot of safe spaces, I'm gonna put air quotes around it, that you don't get people really telling what you feel and think. And leaders really should be worried about that, because a lot of times their frontline workers and managers are not feeling safe enough to say something that they really need to say in order to help avert disasters in organizations. So we need to keep in mind, yes, these things can be overused, but as we're working to learn about them and then use, thank you, Joy, for bringing the word technology into it, is that these advances, these conceptual advances are technologies that we could put to good use, but we have to put it to good use in an inclusive and collaborative way. It's not one person holding all the education around it and all the ideas around it. We all have to work together to make this thing better. It's not going to change unless we do that.
And I just want to emphasize that, Fritz, that somebody with high EQ, I think that allows them to be incredibly direct when they're leading with care and empathy. And I use the analogy all the time. Fritz, I care about your career growth and skill development because I care. I need to give you this feedback. And I can be incredibly direct. I just think in many cases it's performative, where people do want to be nice, as you say, and that just exacerbates a situation where there's not effective communication. We did get a question in with kind of a lead up, so I just want to read this and get the panel's reaction. Emotional intelligence is intricately connected to cultural fluency and humility. When I teach on this, I outline how social awareness and relationship management also requires cultural fluency, especially where diversity is present. In what ways have you seen people who may be otherwise attentive to self-management miss the mark because of a lack of cultural fluency?
It's a great question.
You can see it in spaces where the leaders don't have diversity of input and idea sharing amongst groups that are collaborating on building a culture. I've seen a lot of well-meaning individuals miss things completely because they developed something and then they presented it to people, as opposed to having a well-balanced group of people conceptualizing together and coming up with something together.
Understand their audience.
Yes, because they're leaders that make assumptions, regardless of what those differences are between what that diversity looks like. Just making an assumption that whoever they are with is thinking the same way, feeling the same way they are, instead of creating the space for that person to say how they truly feel, how they truly think.
I have an example of this, and I'm smiling to myself because this literally happened Thursday of last week. I was working with a group and they were trying to do something. They were interested in, how they were going to celebrate different cultures or different marginalized groups throughout the year. And one of the people in the room made a point. They were like, there's like Juneteenth parade, there's a pride parade. How come they don't have like a neurodivergence parade? And somebody had to say, well, have you thought that through? Because they were gaining steam for their idea. And a lot of people that are on the autism spectrum that may suffer from different neurodiverse challenges, a lot of them have issues with sound, people, noise, all the things that you would find at a parade. And this person, well-meaning, well-intentioned, trying to have an innovative idea, just didn't understand that nuance of it. It didn't make them a bad person, didn't mean they were trying to be snarky. They just hadn't thought about it from that point of view. So I think this question of, cultural fluency, this is why having input from multiple people, because if they had been in a room alone, they might have tried to promote that idea of a parade for that. But other people who had more fluency in that particular, with that particular demographic, were able to say, maybe not. So when we talk about, have you seen people who otherwise, who may be otherwise attentive to self-management, they miss the mark? This is what collaboration really is. That somebody else has got your back, and you need to be willing to listen when somebody else says, maybe not, or have you thought that through, or I don't know if that's the best idea. Don't think that they're just hating, they're just not trying to be part of the solution, whatever. They may be trying to stop you from a mistake that you don't see because you're not aware of it. And those cultural, I hesitate to use the phrase blind spots, but that's the one that comes to mind. Those cultural misses can cause us to be seen in a different way. But being willing to listen to other people, I think, can ameliorate a lot of that.
I mean, to that point, Joy, even when you recognize somebody for performing well. In the leadership challenge program, they're one of the disciplines is encouraging the heart, but it suggests that leaders go to people and first, get their permission. Hey, Joy, you did an amazing job on that proposal. Is it okay if I recognize you in front of the group? Because some people may be uncomfortable with that. And it actually has the reverse impact that you thought it would. This is examples where well-intended actions go wrong. If you have high EQ, you might recognize in others that maybe just a thank you note or a private thank you goes a long way more than just recognizing them in front of a group, making them uncomfortable.
The addition to that is that sometimes if you do something that makes someone uncomfortable and they share that with you, being, glad that you recognize, but also asking, could you not recognize them in that way, sometimes can be misinterpreted as being ungrateful. I did all this for you and you didn't like it. You're ungrateful. I'm not going to do anything for you again. And again, it's an amygdala hijack in that moment,
And leaders with high EQ build relationships. They recognize that their teams are different and they recognize that their teams are going to have different needs. So they build those relationships in order for them to show up the best for their teams in their different ways. So exactly what you said before, DB, some people don't like to be publicly recognized. A good leader who is demonstrating high EQ would say, I know Joy likes to be publicly recognized, but DB does not. So Joy did this well. I'm going to publicly recognize her in front of the team. DB also did this well, but I'm going to do it behind the scenes to make him feel comfortable, make him feel supported.
Thank you, Tamara. So, the good news is emotional intelligent behaviors are learned behaviors. And the more you practice and gain experience, the more you can improve on them. So as we're coming up on the hour, we're still welcoming questions, but I'd like to go around the panel for some key takeaways and closing thoughts. Who would like to go first?
I'll start by just reiterating that emotional intelligence is a skill set that can be learned. It's a toolbox. As we mentioned, a new technology that can be used. Just make sure you don't abuse it, but definitely learn it. Yeah.
Go ahead, Tamara.
As I say, I'll echo that by just reinforcing that it's a behavior also. It takes time to learn. It's going to be a small steps towards a larger goal, and being okay with making mistakes, being okay with regressing, being okay with learning as you go, but embracing that the goal is to enhance and develop your emotional intelligence, both individually and as a collective organization.
Yeah, I would say it's, like a lot of other leadership, areas. It's, EQ is common sense, but not commonly practiced. So you have to create an environment within your workplace to give leaders an opportunity to practice. And to Tamara's point, practice involves making mistakes. We're not going to get it right out of the gate. And so you have to provide support and encouragement. Obviously, you don't want to encourage mistakes, but we're human and we're not always going to get it right. And you have to provide an environment where you are continuing to motivate people to be intellectually curious about who they are, how they show up, and the impact they have on other people as well.
I'd say that when you've done this work, as the panel has described, you're going to have a different energy and vibe in spaces and places that you work. And our nervous system is designed to be able to pick up on that, not only energy, but that vibe through the practices and the behaviors that you see and the energy that you're experiencing. And when you feel that kind of love in your environment, yes, I said it, love, you're going to go places. So I love this conversation.
Thank you, Dr. Fritz. And I would just want to emphasize again that this takes time. And I encourage people to focus on incremental change. Be 1% better today than you were yesterday. And if you have that mindset, that incremental change over time becomes substantial. So again, thank you so much to our panel. We're coming in right at the hour. Thank you so much for our audience for joining us. We still welcome your questions and feedback and would love to get your thoughts on what you heard today. Thank you all. Have a great week, and we'll look forward to next time. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, DB.